came home not knowing that there were two killers waiting in her house for her.
911, what is your emergency?
My friend, Teresa Sievers, she's a doctor, and she's dead on the floor.
Hi, I'm Dr. Teresa Sievers, and as I promised you, I was going to be bringing you different modalities of healing.
Dr. Sievers had a very strong personality. A lot of people found her polarizing. They loved her or they didn't.
I want to enjoy my life like it is now. This was almost the perfect crime.
And she just said, I know what happened.
Then how'd you kill her? And he made a stupid little chuckle that he does and then said with a...
One question. No one's answered. Why? Why? Why is Teresa Sievers dead?
Pure and simple, a tale of murder and salaciousness.
You see that, paradise isn't paradise. And maybe these pieces of the puzzle are starting to add up.
County 911, what's the address of your emergency room? Okay, your wife is in a bar, you said she's unresponsive.
This is what he's going to tell you.
How to get out of that situation.
And I grabbed the gun.
Trying to find the first place to put a body.
No, sir.
The only thing they could do was kill him.
You want to say anything? We, the jury.
Hi, I'm Dr. Teresa Sievers.
She was well liked as a doctor. She had a holistic physician's practice.
I don't know about you, but I'm not ready for postmortem. I want to enjoy my life like it is now.
I think everyone that speaks of her, from including her family, talked about her being a dynamo.
Are you ready to drop dead? I'm not.
But at the age of 46, Dr. Teresa Sievers was found dead in the kitchen of her home in Bonita Springs, Florida, brutally murdered.
I mean, this was a violent crime that occurred in the midst of an area that didn't see violent crime and on a street that didn't see violent crime. And people were upset. People were worried.
This doctor had touched many lives and tried to help different people. So I started to get calls from all over. My son goes to that doc. My daughter-in-law goes to that doc. Wow, what a wonderful woman.
She was last seen alive at the Fort Myers, Florida airport the night before.
Because we were able to observe her in the airport on surveillance video, we ended up learning that Dr. Sievers was returning home from a family gathering for her mother's birthday from Connecticut.
Her husband, Mark, and two daughters, Josephine and Carmela, stayed behind.
And Mom came home because Dr. Sievers was the primary breadwinner and she had a practice to run.
But the next day, Dr. Sievers failed to show up at her doctor's office.
The employees at her job started texting her husband, Mark Sievers, saying, hey, Dr. Sievers isn't here.
So her husband called a next-door neighbor, Dr. Mark Petritas, to check on her.
Hey, Mark. This is Mark. Teresa's not at work yet. And the office is calling and texting, and we can't get through to Teresa. Maybe she's just sound asleep. It's just not like her. In all the years I've known her to be a half hour late for work.
Dr. Mark Petritas was the first one who found her.
911, what is your emergency?
I'm at a friend's house. He's out of town, and I came here to check on his wife, and she's dead on the floor.
Oh, sir, hold on, stay on the line.
Yes, yes.
Okay, you're doing very well.
And she's bashed in the back of the head, and she's cold. She's dead cold.
It appeared that nothing had been taken. Did not appear that the house had been ransacked. There was nothing that indicated what the motive might be for what was a very vicious crime.
Upon my initial observations that she has sustained significant head trauma, blunt force in nature, and there was a large pool of blood, and she was a smaller female. You could tell that it was not something that happened quickly.
The case was assigned to Lee County Sheriff's Detectives Mike Downs and David Levitt.
There's no obvious smoking gun, for lack of a better choice of words. Pretty much everybody's a suspect at that point. Who does her nails, who does her hair, who cuts the lawn, do they have a house cleaner, have they had any issues with anybody, does she get along with everybody at work? But nothing really seemed to pan out. We did later find out that she also had a very strong personality, which can rub people the wrong way.
It's not wrong, but it's not enough.
There was also speculation that Dr. Sievers had been targeted because of her practice as a holistic doctor.
Why aren't we doing this kind of medicine for our body? You can have preventive medicine, but it's not the kind of medicine you typically get at your doctor's office.
There was a group of people identify themselves as web sleuths, and they took a very big interest in this case because throughout the country, in at least 2 to possibly 3 other states at that time, there were some doctors that also practiced holistic medicine as well as internal medicine that died. And the theory was that they were all murdered and that we had to look at because, like Mike said, right now, it's everybody and their brother.
The theory of it was that there were certain holistic doctors who were being murdered because they had maybe a cure for cancer or had something that the government or some kind of shadowy group didn't want them to talk about. But that turned out to not to be the case.
Just for the record, state your name one more time for me.
Mark Severs.
And to be thorough, the detectives did conduct an interview with Teresa's husband, Mark, once he returned from Connecticut.
Anytime there is a brutal murder of a spouse, one tends to look, or at least glance, at the other spouse. But in this case, the spouse was thousands of miles away in Connecticut at the time that the crime was committed, with an alibi that was absolutely airtight.
I guess I feel pathetic, but at the same time, there's so much going on.
That's not pathetic.
It's hard. I feel that I could have stopped this from happening. How do I get over that feeling?
It's gonna take time. It really will.
Can you tell me when she died? I need to know if she tortured you. What happened to her?
We can't tell this stage. We're still working on that.
She had so much to offer the world. She was really... Everyone says this about their wife. It should have been me. I should have been home.
Everyone kept describing Mark as her rock, and she was his rock. Have you ever cheated on your wife?
I've never cheated on her, and she's never cheated on me.
Have you ever had anyone have an unhealthy obsession with either you or your wife or your kids or anything?
I absolutely can't think of anybody that would have been with that at all.
The detectives ended the interview so Mark Severs could plan Teresa's funeral and grieve with their 2 daughters.
Yeah, the funeral was befitting somebody of her stature. Here's this lady that really helped everybody, and now she's gone, and they mourned that fact.
But still, not a single clue about who had been waiting for Teresa that Sunday night as she pulled into her garage after telling her husband she was home and she was safe.
How had anyone gone into this crime scene, committed this horrific crime, and left absolutely no trace evidence? This was almost the perfect crime.
Until a late-night phone call would lead detectives to a small town in Missouri.
And we catch a break. We get a tip.
And she just said, I know what happened.
The call that would be the turning point in the case came into the Lee County Sheriff's Office late at night, some 2 weeks after the murder of Dr. Teresa Severs.
Thank God. I thought, praise God. Seriously.
The tip came from a family friend of a man in a small town in Missouri, Hillsboro, Missouri. A man by the name of Curtis Wayne Wright, a 5-time convicted felon.
Sure enough, the more we dug, the more evidence started to pile up for us, thankfully.
And soon the detectives were on the trail of a second career criminal who was a close friend of Curtis Wayne Wright, a man by the name of Jimmy Ray Rogers.
Jimmy Ray Rogers liked to call himself the Hammer. It was on his Facebook. He liked to refer to himself as the Hammer.
Both men, Jimmy Ray Rogers and Curtis Wayne Wright, were now very much persons of interest, but they both had denied being in Florida at the time of the murder.
And Curtis Wright told us that during the weekend of the murder, first he told us he was homesick in bed and never left his trailer. And then at one point he said, well, I was working on a car all weekend. And Jimmy was beside himself. He barely talked to us, and then just let us know he just doesn't like cops, so I'm not going to talk to you. I didn't go to Florida, and I don't talk to Wayne. He's a nerd. Oh, okay. See you later, Jimmy.
But even with the tip and the detective's gut feelings, there still wasn't anywhere near enough to arrest them. and the detectives returned to Florida deflated.
We had a lot of digital evidence that we found that we knew we had to process and try and piece it together. Most notably, when we did the initial warrant on the Curtis Wainwright residence, there was a vehicle in the driveway, and we found a GPS in the center console. So we were hoping, let's just hope he entered addresses in here, let's hope it tracked his movement. And at first, we're deflated again because they're telling us this information is deleted and we can't interpret the code. So they spent a significant amount of time, hundreds and hundreds of man-hours, trying to figure out this code to recover this deleted data.
And bingo.
They were able to establish a route from Curtis Wainwright's residence in Hillsborough, Missouri, and he makes a route there to go to Jimmy Rogers' residence in Cadet, Missouri. We went from 0 to 60 in a very short amount of time.
And then 1,104 miles south along Interstate 75, off the exit to Bonita Springs, and then right to Jarvis Road, the home of Dr. Teresa Sievers.
I think it was an aha moment, and I think at that moment there is the, wait a minute, we have people saying we're not here, and they are.
Retrieving that address, which would have been deleted just hours or days later, and placing the killers in the area of our victim was a critical piece of this puzzle.
And the GPS data showed their every movement on the way south.
One of the significant locations was a Walmart actually right across the street from the sheriff's office here, where we're able to capture what we believe and what is evidently Curtis Wainwright and Jimmy Ray Rogers walking into Walmart, buying a number of suspicious items, lockpick set, garbage bags, cleaning items, things like that. So now we know they're down here. We could see them clear as day on the video. On the day Dr. Sievers returned home. We couldn't even believe it. The only thing we can think of is that they never thought we'd ever come up there because it's over 1,000 miles away, that they never would put two and two together.
And when the detectives returned to Missouri and went to question the Hammer's girlfriend, Taylor Showmaker, they hit even more pay dirt.
And she started crying, and she just said, I know what happened.
And I told him that I knew that he had something to do with it.
Okay.
And then he started asking me questions like, what do I know about it? And I'm like, well, I know you went down there to kill somebody. And then he said, yeah. I said, did you shoot her? And he said, no. And I said, then how'd you kill her? And he made a stupid little chuckle that he does and then said, with a hammer.
He said with a hammer?
Yeah.
Her man had confessed to her while lying in bed.
It's huge because he actually confessed. Jimmy Ray Rogers confessed to the murder and specifically said that they used a hammer, which is consistent with the physical evidence that we recovered from the scene.
And then Taylor Showmaker took Detective Lebed to the area where she had helped her boyfriend, the Hammer, dispose of some of the evidence, including a blue jumpsuit he said he wore during the murder.
Case number 15-268513. Time now is currently 6:38 p.m. on Tuesday, August 25th, 2015. All right, Mission Maker, can you just walk me over to where you've identified the overalls?
And then she goes, there it is right there. And sure enough, we get out, we walk up to it, and it's a blue jumpsuit sitting on the side of the road.
How did we come to find these items today?
Because I threw them out the window.
Okay, and what was the reason for throwing these out the window?
Because he murdered somebody.
Who is he?
Jimmy Rogers.
They had their evidence. They had their killers. But the investigation was far from over. Curtis Wainwright now tells the authorities he has information they will want if he can make a deal with them.
So as difficult as it was to us a decision that had to be made to let Wright plead to second-degree murder and receive a sentence of 25 years, provided he testified truthfully.
Wright's information involved his best friend in high school, back in Missouri, Mark Sievers, Teresa Sievers' husband. And now it was turning into a case of murder for hire.
Just breathe. Slow breathing. Till we get oxygen and makes you feel better. Through the nose. Thank you. There you go, see?
Even before his best friend in Missouri had implicated Mark Sievers in the murder of his wife Teresa, the detectives were already suspicious of Sievers, especially after a second round of questioning.
We've met many people through our investigations that have lost a loved one, and he seemed fake.
When detectives would leave the interrogation room, they had a sense Sievers was playing to the cameras.
I know you put this bastard in jail. Okay, she got hit coming in the house.
I saw a lot of simulated behavior. It didn't feel real.
How could you have been hit?
It was so much of a, what would appear to be so much of a show.
Now, talking about your relationship, have you guys been contemplating any kind of separation or divorce? Has there been any marital problems?
The detectives would later learn from friends and family the couple indeed had both marital and financial problems.
What are some of the biggest motives for anybody to do something they shouldn't? Money's a big one. Infidelity's another. So we have two of those on the board right now. You can see there's more of a darker side to who he really was and who he wanted to show us.
As he was leaving, he said, "I'll do anything I can to cooperate, to assist, to catch this killer."
I want to speak to you every chance I can. Excellent. I program your number in my phone, so when you call me, I know it's you. Okay.
And it isn't a week later when he's no longer willing to cooperate.
Well, he had his lawyer contact us and shut off all contact. He ghosted us. He stopped talking. He stopped cooperating.
But prosecutors did not need Sievers' cooperation to make their case. And the first test came with the trial of Jimmy Ray Rogers, everything hinging on whether a jury would believe Curtis Wayne Wright and his chilling version of the murder of Teresa Sievers.
We came there to kill her.
Teresa Sievers' mother and sister were in the courtroom every day.
Were you able to see where he was hitting her with the hammer?
In the head.
And what happened after she fell on the floor?
He continued to hit her.
He continued to hit her?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes. I physically walked over to the area where he was at and asked him to stop. I mean, put my hand on him.
It didn't take long for the jury to return a verdict.
We have a verdict in the Jimmy Ray Rogers case. Yes, we do have a guilty verdict. We do have a guilty verdict in Jimmy Ray Rogers, but it is of second-degree murder, not a first-degree murder.
Rogers was later sentenced to 25 years in prison. But for prosecutors, there would be no justice unless they could make a case against the man they believed had hired the killers, Mark Sievers.
But for Mark Sievers, there would have been no funeral. There would have been no grieving family. There would have been no children without parents. It was important that all that participated were held accountable.
The evidence against Sievers continued to mount, including his use of prepaid, or what are called burner phones, used by both men.
Mark Sievers and Curtis Wayne Wright had a secret communication system set up.
Their code word together was switch to other or other. They would almost immediately switch over to these prepaid phones, and we were able to establish a connection.
According to what Wright told the detectives, the plan for the murder was made when Mark Sievers attended Wright's wedding in Missouri 2 months earlier.
This is basically where it all, started to come together. Mark suggested two scenarios. One was to shoot her or kill her outside of the medical practice when she was leaving work one night. Curtis explains to me, he says, well, what if she's with somebody when she comes out of the medical practice? And Mark says, well, that'll be better because if somebody else is killed during the offense, then it's likely to keep the suspicion off of me or anybody else. So, and he explained it as collateral damage, which goes to show you the type of person Mark Sievers really is.
When the time came to arrest Mark Sievers, detectives knew from their surveillance exactly where to find him.
So there wasn't really anywhere Mr. Sievers was going to go where we couldn't find him, unless he had a ride into outer space that we didn't know about.
He was at home, but there was concern he was armed and might resist taking his daughters hostage.
We knew that if he had been watching TV, and he knows we got him, we knew we had to get Mark Sievers, but most importantly, we had to extract him and save those children.
The job fell to Detective David Levitt.
We knew he had many guns in the home, but his behavior was erratic. So that, coupled with the fact that if he knows he's getting arrested for the murder of his wife, he has guns in the home, and there's 2 little girls present. So we were very worried. So we get to the door. I see the girls' heads kind of perk up and look towards the door. And then I see Mark start to come towards the door, phone's in his hand, and he turns around and starts to walk away. So I said to the deputy who was with me, said, we're giving this another 5 seconds and we're forcing entry. Fortunately, within half that time, he came back, opened the door, and leaned out with his phone in his hand and grabbed him by his wrist. You're under arrest for murdering your wife.
And when Mark arrived, he had a smirk that I'll never forget. It was a smirk, it was 1,000-mile stare. He was ice cold. You could look at him and see he was ice cold, no blood in his veins, and he knew he was caught.
But the defense was preparing a surprise twist that not only was Curtis Wayne Wright a killer and a skilled liar, but that Wright was actually in love with Mark Sievers and killed Teresa on his own to get her out of the way.
If Curtis can't have Mark, nobody can.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. Right now, we are going to see opening statements at around 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in the trial of Mark Sievers.
With reporters fascinated about how much Mark Sievers and Curtis Wayne Wright looked like each other.
They do look nearly identical.
I can't wait just to see these 2 former best friends looking at each other in court, one of them testifying against another. That's something straight out of a movie.
For the record, both assistant state attorneys are present, Mr. Sievers is present, and both defense counsel. State's ready. Defense is ready.
The courtroom was packed, and like a wedding, there was a side for the wife, the victim's family, and a side for the husband, the accused murderer's family.
A little antagonistic in the crowd.
But unlike that day 12 years earlier, when Teresa and Mark Sievers were married, there was no joy on either side today.
We'll move to opening statements at this time. State.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Cynthia Ross is the head of the homicide unit in the state's attorney's office. Her first priority was to make sure the jury knew the importance of her key witness, Curtis Wayne Wright, but that he was hardly a model citizen.
We were asking them to believe a killer. Curtis Wayne Wright allows us to hear the conversations that occurred between he and Mark Sievers. To hear how Mark Sievers solicited, conspired, and arranged the murder of Teresa Sievers.
Defense.
Mark Sievers chose Michael Mummert as the lawyer to defend him in the murder case after the 2 bonded during proceedings over the custody of Sievers' children.
On a very personal level, he's a very nice man. He's kind of goofy, kind of funny, and over the 4 years that I represented Mark, I got to like him. I really do like Mark.
You're going to hear about prepaid phones. You're going to hear about divorce, infidelity, life insurance as a motive. But ultimately, all the evidence of a conspiracy, all the evidence of Mr. Sievers' involvement is going to come from one man. And that's Curtis Wayne Wright.
I wanted to convey to the jury that this was a credibility trial of Curtis Wayne Wright.
Next witness.
It was the very next day that Curtis Wayne Wright took the stand. And at first, Sievers gave off the impression of not having a care in the world, smiling and cracking jokes with his lawyer. But that would quickly change.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give...
Wright was questioned by prosecutor Hamid Hunter.
The biggest moment in the trial was Mr. Wright taking the stand. These two men have been best friends most of their lives.
Mr. Wright, who killed Dr. Teresa Severs?
Jimmy Rogers and I physically did it, but Mark Severs was also involved in the planning.
Why did you do it?
I was asked to do it.
By whom?
Mr. Severs.
Is Mr. Severs in court today?
Yes, he is.
Can you please point to Mr. Severs and identify him by an article of clothing?
He's the middle gentleman there at the table. The darker colored jacket.
Well, I'm not a fan of Curtis Wright. He's a killer. He's an admitted killer. And so we went straight at him. There wasn't going to be any compromises for Mr. Wright.
And Wright was immediately confronted about his earlier lies when he tried to pin all the blame on Jimmy Ray Rogers.
Did you tell us the truth?
Not in the beginning.
Started out with a lie?
Well, it started out with the truth, but it got off in the middle, and then those lies were corrected. I told the truth before the end of that statement.
Watching all this in the courtroom was Severs' stepmother from Missouri, who has known Wright since he was 12 years old.
I'm not a human lie detector, but he did a magnificent job of lying. He's a pathological liar.
Wright testified that he and Severs, that's Severs on the left, made the deal to kill Teresa at Wright's wedding in Missouri a few months earlier.
He told me that he and Teresa were having problems, marital problems. He told me that she was having an affair, and that they were having financial problems as well, considering bankruptcy.
Did he ask you to do anything?
He told me that really the only option that he had was for her to die. And he said that he needed to have her killed.
Wright said he received a $600 check from Severs to cover expenses for driving to Florida, with the promise of much more to come.
He said that there was a lot of insurance, that him and the kids would be well taken care of, and that he had at least $100,000 to offer to have it done.
And then Wright's chilling description of how Dr. Teresa Severs was killed the night she returned home alone, just as he had testified earlier at the trial of Jimmy Ray Rogers.
The headlights would have been right on me. I jumped up and I followed her into the house.
And when she started to turn towards you, what did you do?
I hit her. I hit her with the hammer.
Does she see you?
Yes, because I accidentally kicked the dog dish over. The dishes went flying everywhere. It made a huge noise. It startled her. I was afraid that if she turned around, she would scratch me or do something to leave evidence. I swung the hammer and I hit her.
Did you and Dr. Severs ever make eye contact?
Yes.
How did she look when you made eye contact with her?
Surprised.
Did she fight?
Yeah.
You fought for her life?
Yeah. I never in a million years envisioned beating her to death with a hammer.
On cross-examination of Wright, Mark Severs' lawyer tried to push a theory about Wright's sexual orientation that he thought would explain what happened.
Detective Levitt asked you about your sexual preference, didn't he?
Yes.
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
Detective Levitt wanted to know if you had a sexual relationship with Mark Severs, didn't you?
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
The judge told Mummert to move on.
That was a tough one because there was something there. There was this air of possessiveness or intimacy, and if Curtis can't have Mark, nobody can. My theory is that when Mark went to Curtis's wedding, that Curtis just had enough. Mark married a beautiful doctor. Mark had two beautiful girls. Mark lived in a nice home in Bonita Springs, Florida. Why does Mark get to have it all? And I believe that anger, as well as a possible, sexual attraction to Mark, caused the basis for Curtis to finally say, no, I've had enough. I'm going to go down there. I'm going to kill Mark's wife.
But Judge Bruce Kyle was having none of it, and Mummert had to change his tact, now challenging Wright about the money he claims Sievers promised him. Why didn't Sievers just tell him to take the cash that was in the house?
You know that there was nearly $50,000 in that home, is that correct?
I found that out later, but no, I didn't know that.
So there was $50,000 when you went down to commit the murder, is that correct?
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't know.
Sustained. Proper.
Mr. Sievers never said, I have all this money, and I'm going to set it aside for you, and you just take it, correct?
Correct.
And then after the murder, you came down again for the funeral, is that correct?
Yes.
Having the mission completed, right?
Yes.
Did you ever get $50,000 in cash at that time?
No, our agreement was it would be paid after he got his life insurance payment.
I don't believe Mark ever gave the go-ahead. But Teresa was worth more alive than dead. Why would he want to give that up?
As Sievers watched his best friend testify, the smiles and jokes seemed to be replaced by tears and grief. Was it authentic or a performance for the jury?
For us, it seemed that Mark Sievers was not the grieving husband, but just someone who could bring on tears when desired. And so we hoped that the jury would see those tears for what they were, not of those of a grieving husband, but those of a manipulator.
But some of the jurors had been in tears too.
The evidence has shown that Mark Sievers hired Curtis Wright, his best friend, to kill his wife, Dr. Teresa Sievers. An unconscionable act in light of that sacred contract. So Mr. Wright is a felon. He's an admitted liar. Need to tell us the truth?
Not in the beginning.
He's a killer. I mean, Mr. Sievers could ask you to kill his wife and you would actually consider it?
Yes.
By himself, there's no reason why any reasonable person should believe a word he says. But he's corroborated by evidence. Mr. Wright says he came to Florida to kill Dr. Sievers with Jimmy Rogers. There's evidence of that. Corroborative evidence. I want you to consider asking why. I want you to keep asking why. She's not a captain of industry. She's not a politician.
Hi, I'm Dr. Teresa Sievers.
She's a medical doctor and a mother of two, and a wife. And she's dead.
Good morning. You've now heard all the evidence. And one question no one's answered. Why? Why? Why is Teresa Sievers dead? The best answer we can give you is she is dead because Curtis Wayne Wright killed her. And without Mr. Wright, there is no case. And the crime scene itself, those photos, they're hard to look at. And they're hard to look at because that crime scene is anger, and it's violence, and it's rage, and it's hate. It is not murder for money. Ultimately, the one question you all have to ask yourselves: do you trust Curtis Wayne Wright?
The jury began its deliberations just before lunchtime.
You know, you always hope it'll be fast because of the anxiety and waiting for the verdict.
When the jury goes out, you just say, we did everything we could. We did everything that we reasonably could.
It was only 4 hours later when the judge called everyone back into court.
I've been told we have a verdict. State's ready. Defense is ready. So either side need any time to talk to their sides or their parties, because these things are tough, and I'm not going to have any outbursts. We'll let the clerk publish the verdict.
This was almost the perfect crime.
In the Circuit Court of the 20th Judicial Circuit, in and for Lee County, Florida, criminal action. State of Florida versus Mark D. Sievers, case number 15 CF 673B.
Do you trust Curtis Wainwright?
Verdict. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant in this case. Count 1, first-degree murder. The defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. Conspiracy. The defendant is guilty of conspiracy. So say we all, December 4th, 2019, by the foreperson.
He broke down eventually there, but when that verdict was read, he was pretty stoic.
Now the question of how Mark Sievers should be punished.
My partner and I were going to have to sit down now and ask this jury to recommend a sentence of death for Mr. Sievers.
The jury would have to find the murder was committed for either pecuniary, financial gain, or in a cold, calculated manner, or both. And the jury also had to consider what's called a victim impact statement from Teresa Sievers' mother, Mary Ann Groves, who is now allowed to speak publicly of her loss and her grief.
And of course, the biggest loss falls upon her two daughters, whom Teresa loved with all her heart. These two girls have been robbed of their remarkable mother, their home, their pets, their possessions, their family and friends. Teresa will not be able to love and guide them. She won't be there when they graduate high school or when they need their mother to kiss away tears from their first heartbreak. We have lost our Teresa, the light of our lives, the star of our family, who loved us all so fiercely. It has been hard for all of us to go on with our daily lives. The void is unimaginable. She was our strength, our inspiration, and our caretaker.
Only one juror needed to oppose the sentence of death, and the jury was back in just 3 hours. The first question the jury had to answer was the murder committed for financial, pecuniary reasons.
The capital murder was committed for pecuniary gain? No.
Now the question of whether the murder was committed in a cold, calculated manner.
Yes. We, the jury, unanimously find that Mark Sievers should be sentenced to death? Yes.
But the judge still had the power to overrule the jury's death sentence, and he revealed something the jury had not been told. Sievers' eldest daughter had written a letter asking that her father's life be spared.
The letter essentially said, in not so many words, while I don't want a relationship with my father, if I decide that I might at some time in the future, I can't have that if he is sentenced to death and taken from me.
And then for the first time, the court heard from Mark Sievers, defiant and showing no signs of remorse.
Is it okay if I refer to my notes?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Although a jury found me guilty, I am innocent of all charges, as I have maintained since this heinous crime took place. I love my wife, Teresa, and our two daughters, Josie and Carmi, with all my heart. Our girls have tragically lost their mommy, and now they're about to lose their daddy as well. Therefore, I respectfully ask the court for life, as not to compound their loss and suffering. I am grateful, however, that the court can only determine my fate on earth, while my soul is in God's hands, and God knows the truth. Although I cannot feel remorse for something I had absolutely nothing to do with, I am deeply saddened and forever heartbroken, to say the very least, that Teresa was taken from us.
Mark Sievers was crying for Mark Sievers. He hadn't shed a single tear for Teresa Sievers at any time. The only tears Mark Sievers ever shed were for Mark Sievers.
Teresa is my soulmate. I will miss her and cherish her memories until we are reunited in heaven. Until then, I will fight this wrongful conviction until I am proven innocent and set free to rejoin my family.
Now the judge had to weigh the factors in favor of overturning the jury's decision that Mark Sievers should be put to death.
I will note for the record that his children do not want the death penalty imposed, and he was a hands-on, devoted father, and he did help people who were in need.
But it was not enough.
A jury of 12 have found you guilty as charged, so you are guilty. And this is the order of the court that you be sentenced to death, sir. You feel so terrible for the family. I feel so terrible for the girls because their father orphaned them.
Mark, even if you believe everything they said, did not commit an act of violence. Mark is the only person, Florida's death row right now, who did not commit an act of violence.
To hear the judge say, death penalty, justice is served. He got exactly what he deserved. He got exactly what he deserved.
I judge people's actions. I don't judge people's souls. And if I'm wrong, hopefully God will have mercy on both of us.
Part 4, Identifying the Perpetrator, the identification of Jeffrey McDonald as the perpetrator did not happen like a sudden door swinging open in a detective story. There was no single witness who stepped forward with a clean memory and pointed across a courtroom. There was no hidden photograph, no recovered confession, no dramatic object found years later in a forgotten drawer that instantly transformed doubt into certainty. The case turned because the physical world inside 544 Castle Drive kept refusing to obey the story McDonald told. The house did not identify him with a human voice, it identified him by contradiction. Every room asked a question. Every question narrowed the space in which the intruder narrative could breathe. The living room asked why a violent fight with several armed attackers had left so little convincing disorder. The bedrooms asked why the worst bloodshed was concentrated where the family members slept. The pajama top asked why its threads and punctures seemed to belong to a sequence different from the one McDonald described. The blood evidence asked why the movements through the house looked less like the path of strangers, and more like the path of someone moving among familiar rooms after intimate violence. The weapons asked why tools connected to the home appeared outside the back door, wiped and discarded like props at the edge of a stage. The case did not move toward McDonald because investigators simply disliked his story. It moved toward him because the story seemed to grow weaker each time it touched an object. In the official theory that later formed around the evidence, McDonald's identification emerged from a reconstruction of movement, injury, staging, and motive. The prosecution did not need to claim that every second of the night could be known with perfect precision. No homicide reconstruction can fully restore the private reality of a room after all but one adult witness is dead. But prosecutors argued that the broad architecture was clear enough. Jeffrey McDonald killed Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen, then staged the home to resemble an attack by drug-crazed intruders. borrowing imagery from the violent cultural fears of 1970. Later court records describe investigators as concluding that MacDonald had committed the murders and staged the crime scene. And one major focus of that conclusion was the physical evidence that did not support his version of events. Justia Law 1. The first great pressure point was the living room. MacDonald placed his own attack there. He said he had been sleeping on the couch when he woke to screams and saw intruders. If his account were true, that room should have carried the heavy signature of a desperate struggle between a physically fit army doctor and several armed assailants. The imagination naturally supplies overturned furniture, scattered objects, blood from multiple people, fabric torn in motion, the marks of bodies colliding with walls and floor. But investigators found a room that seemed oddly restrained. The disorder was present but not persuasive in proportion to the story. A flower pot had tipped. A coffee table was displaced. Some items suggested disturbance, but not the kind of wild, extended combat MacDonald described. Later accounts emphasized the absence of pajama fibers in the living room, even though MacDonald said his pajama top was torn there during the struggle, while numerous fibers were found in areas where, by his account, the pajama top should not have been traveling in the same way. Case Law 2. This was not a minor discrepancy. A torn pajama top should shed where it is torn. If the garment was ripped during a struggle in the living room, investigators expected that room to remember it. Instead, the garment seemed to have left its strongest memory in the bedrooms, especially near Colette and the children. The fabric, in effect, displaced the struggle. It pulled attention away from the couch and toward the rooms where the victims died. The pajama top became one of the most important witnesses because it connected MacDonald's body, Colette's body, and the alleged staging in a single object. It was found on or near Colette in the master bedroom, bloodstained and torn, no longer simply clothing, but a map of contact. Blood analysis showed that much of the staining on the garment was Colette's type A blood. Other stains included Jeffrey's type B blood and Kimberly's type AB blood, a distribution that mattered because MacDonald said he had not been wearing the pajama top when he discovered Kimberly. MacDonald Case Facts 3. If Kimberly's blood was on the pajama top, investigators had to ask when and how it arrived there. If MacDonald had removed the garment before going to the children's rooms, the presence of Kimberly's blood was difficult to reconcile with his account. The garment did not merely contradict a small detail, it challenged his sequence of movement. The prosecution's theory gave the pajama top a darker role. Not a garment torn from him by attackers, but an item used after the violence, placed over Colette and punctured to create the impression that it had been involved in the supposed intruder attack. Later descriptions of the evidence noted that the pajama top contained numerous puncture holes and that investigators considered the puncture pattern inconsistent with MacDonald's account of wearing it during a moving struggle. MacDonald Case Facts 4. In narrative terms, this was devastating because MacDonald's pajama top had functioned as part of his hero-victim image. He had described it as something that trapped him, limited him, made him vulnerable as he fought back. The prosecution transformed that same object into an accusation, arguing that it showed not helplessness, but manipulation. The garment's threads deepened the accusation. Threads and yarns from the blue pajama top were central to the government's trial presentation, and later appellate summaries recognized their importance in the prosecution's theory. Case Law 2. Fibers were found in locations that made more sense if the pajama top had been present during events in the bedrooms than if it had been torn only in the living room and then placed aside in the way MacDonald described. One account of the forensic theory notes that fibers from the pajama top were found beneath Colette's body and in the children's bedrooms, while the living room did not contain the expected distribution of such fibers from the alleged struggle. Wikipedia 5. Fibers are small things, easy for a storyteller to overlook because they do not carry emotional drama. A guilty person staging a scene might think of blood, weapons, and broken furniture. He might think of a dramatic phrase written on a wall or headboard. He might think of a wound that proves survival. but fibers belong to the stubborn humility of evidence. They fall where cloth is torn, where bodies move, where objects touch. They do not care about the story a person later tells. If they are preserved and interpreted correctly, they become quiet witnesses to motion. In the MacDonald case, those quiet witnesses seemed to follow Jeffrey MacDonald into places his story tried to avoid. The blood evidence formed the next great structure of identification. The MacDonald family's different blood types gave investigators a forensic advantage unusual enough to shape the whole case. Colette, Kimberly, Kristen, and Jeffrey did not all share the same type, which allowed analysts to connect stains to specific likely sources. Before DNA testing, this kind of differentiation could not identify a person with modern certainty. But in a closed family environment, it allowed investigators to create a meaningful map. In that map, Colette's blood appeared in places that suggested movement beyond the master bedroom. One of the most striking pieces of evidence later cited in federal court was a footprint in Colette's blood, matching MacDonald, found leaving Kristen's bedroom. Justia Law 1, the image is almost unbearably intimate, a husband's foot, marked in his wife's blood, moving out of the room where his youngest daughter lay. The defense could argue about contamination, sequence, emergency movement, or confusion. But the prosecution saw the footprint as one of the house's clearest accusations. It suggested that MacDonald had been in Kristen's room with Colette's blood on him or underfoot, a fact that fit the government's reconstruction more comfortably than his own. The footprint did not speak with emotion. It did not explain motive. It simply placed him in a pattern of movement that mattered. In domestic homicide, movement often reveals what the killer later tries to hide. A body moved from one room to another. A weapon taken from one area and placed in another. A bloody footstep where it should not be. A stain from one victim appearing near another. These details do not look dramatic in isolation, but together they can show sequence. The prosecution's reconstruction suggested that the attack on Colette and the children unfolded across more than one room, with MacDonald moving through the house in a way that connected the victims. Colette's blood in or near Kristen's room suggested that Colette herself may have moved there or been connected to that space during the violence. The government theory, in one of its most haunting forms, proposed that Colette, gravely injured but not yet dead, may have tried to reach one of her children, or that her blood was carried there during MacDonald's movements. The details remain disputed, but the emotional force is unavoidable. If Colette was still alive after the initial attack, the house may have contained a final desperate movement of a mother toward a child. That possibility gives the evidence a human dimension beyond forensic mapping. It suggests not only where blood went, but what love might have tried to do in the last moments of consciousness. Identifying MacDonald required investigators to strip away the theatrical surface of the intruder's story. The alleged attackers had almost too much symbolic value and too little physical reality. MacDonald described them as drug-associated outsiders, including a woman with long hair and a candle. That detail would later draw attention because of how closely it seemed to fit the cultural fear created by the Manson family crimes. And commentators have noted the suspicion that MacDonald's account borrowed from that atmosphere, particularly with an Esquire magazine containing material about the Manson murders found in the home. NCDL 6, the word pig, written in blood, intensified that connection. If real intruders wrote it, they had entered the house carrying not only weapons, but a ready-made cultural script. If MacDonald wrote it, he had turned public fear into camouflage. Investigators increasingly believed the second possibility. The blood writing looked less like the spontaneous act of outsiders fleeing a brutal multi-victim murder and more like a message staged for discovery. It had a purpose. It pointed away. It said, "Look at the world outside this house. Look at hippies, drugs, cults, Manson, chaos. Do not look too long at the husband." Staging often works by creating an image strong enough to overpower mechanics. McDonald's alleged staging gave investigators an image, but the mechanics resisted it. The lack of clear forced entry became part of that resistance. For violent intruders entering a family home on a military base, attacking 4 people, leaving messages, and escaping without leaving strong identifying traces created a problem. Such a thing is not impossible. Impossibility is too strong a word in homicide work. But criminal investigation is rarely about what is abstractly possible. It is about what is supported. The intruder story had emotional support because America in 1970 could imagine such attackers. It had descriptive support because McDonald supplied details. It had circumstantial echoes in the unstable later figure of Helena Stokely. But it lacked the kind of physical support that could compete with the evidence tying McDonald's movements and clothing to the crime scene. Stokely's role complicated identification without overturning it. She was the kind of person who could keep doubt alive, troubled, contradictory, connected to the local drug scene, and in some accounts associated with clothing or behavior that seemed to resemble McDonald's description of the female intruder. The defense later emphasized claims that she had confessed or suggested involvement. At trial, she testified that she owned a blonde wig and floppy hat and usually wore black clothing, but also claimed memory loss for the key hours around the murders. McDonald's lawyers attempted to introduce hearsay testimony about alleged confessions she had made to others, and CDL 6 to defenders. That looked like the missing woman from McDonald's story flickering into view. To prosecutors, it looked like the unstable gravity of a famous crime drawing an unreliable witness into its orbit. Courts and jurors had to decide whether Stokely represented a genuine alternative perpetrator or a cloud of confusion. The government's identification of McDonald depended partly on showing that Stokely and other alleged intruders were not truly anchored to the scene. They could be imagined near the crime, but they could not be physically placed inside it in the way McDonald could. Their uncertainty was not enough to erase the certainty of his presence, his story, his clothing, his footprints, and his family's blood. The weapons also pointed inward. Items later associated with the murders included a club or piece of lumber, knives, and an ice pick, with important objects found outside near the back of the home and linked by investigators to the household rather than to strangers arriving armed from elsewhere. The fact that the weapons appeared to have been wiped or left outside gave the prosecution a staging argument. A real group of intruders might bring weapons and take them away, or seize household weapons in a frenzy and abandon them unpredictably. But the recovered weapons looked, to investigators, like part of an arranged exit narrative. Here are the tools, outside the house, suggesting flight. The club became especially important because bloodstained splinters and fibers could be connected to multiple rooms, suggesting movement of the weapon through the house rather than a single isolated attack point. The government's theory turned the weapon evidence into a sequence. Violence spreading through the bedrooms, followed by a staged disposal outside. Again, the identification of McDonald did not rely on one object alone. It relied on convergence. His story required the evidence to scatter outward toward unknown persons. Instead, the evidence gathered inward around him. Motive in the prosecution's presentation was more difficult because no simple public motive explained the annihilation of a pregnant wife and 2 small children. McDonald did not have the obvious profile of a man at the end of a visible collapse. He was not publicly ruined. He was not known as a neighborhood menace. That absence created space for defenders to ask why he would do such a thing. But motive in family killings can be private, irrational, shame-based, rage-based, or tied to a self-image that outsiders do not fully see. Investigators and prosecutors suggested that an argument or domestic conflict escalated violently, perhaps beginning with Colette and then expanding when the children became witnesses or victims within the same eruption. The psychology of such a crime is not the psychology of a stranger attack. It is the psychology of possession, panic, and self-preservation. A man can love the image of being a husband and father without truly loving the burdens and realities of his family. A man can see his family as proof of success until, in a moment of rage or exposure, they become threats to the self he needs to protect. If MacDonald killed them, then the staging was not an afterthought in the shallow sense. It was a psychological necessity. The polished doctor could not remain polished if the house told the truth. The intruder story allowed him to remain the central character as victim rather than perpetrator. He could be pitted instead of condemned. He could speak instead of being spoken about. He could turn the deaths of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen into the background of his own survival. That is why staging, in this case, was not merely physical. It was narrative staging. The house was arranged, but so was the meaning of the house. The process of identifying MacDonald also required investigators to confront the earlier Army failure. The Article 32 proceeding had ended in dismissal of charges, and that dismissal created a public and legal obstacle. A man once accused and released gains a kind of defensive aura. He can say the system already looked and found the case wanting. He can describe renewed investigation as persecution. He can turn delay into proof that the government does not really know what it is doing. For prosecutors to identify him again, years later, they had to do more than repeat the Army's suspicion. They had to build a fuller case. One capable of surviving the defense claim that the early investigation was flawed and the charges had once been rejected. Alfred Kassab's persistence mattered here. Colette's stepfather became a relentless force pushing authorities to reconsider MacDonald not as a tragic survivor, but as the likely killer. His transformation from supporter to accuser added moral weight to the renewed investigation because it showed that suspicion had not been born from institutional pride alone. It had grown inside the victim's family, in people who had once wanted to believe MacDonald. That reversal is psychologically powerful. The easiest path for a grieving family would have been to hold on to the intruder story, to mourn alongside the surviving son-in-law, to locate evil outside the family circle. For the Kassabs to turn against MacDonald meant accepting a more intimate horror. Their insistence helped keep the case alive until federal authorities moved forward. When a grand jury indicted MacDonald in 1975, the identification of the perpetrator became formal. The government was no longer merely suspicious. It was saying, in the language of federal prosecution, that the polished Army doctor had been the man inside the violence. The indictment charged him in the deaths of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen, and it transformed years of forensic argument into a legal accusation. But even then, identification did not become immediate trial. MacDonald fought the indictment, arguing that the delay violated his right to a speedy trial. And the case moved through procedural battles before trial began in 1979. The long delay affected the emotional meaning of identification. For nearly 9 years after the murders, MacDonald existed in a contested space. Publicly accused by some, defended by others, free for much of that period, and able to build a life beyond the home where his family died. For the Kassabs, each passing year must have felt like an insult added to grief. For MacDonald, each passing year allowed him to strengthen his identity as the wronged survivor. By the time jurors would hear the case, they were not only hearing about one night in 1970. They were hearing about 9 years of argument over whether the only surviving adult had turned himself into the author of a lie. One of the most significant aspects of the identification process was that it asked jurors and the public to accept a perpetrator who did not fit the easiest emotional category. The alleged killer was not a nameless intruder. He was a father with family photographs. He was a doctor who could save lives. He was an Army officer in a military community. He had been injured. He had spoken urgently for help. He had told a story that placed him in danger too. The prosecution had to break the protective shell of those facts without pretending they did not exist. MacDonald's status was real. His injuries were real. His intelligence was real. His ability to persuade was real. but none of that made him innocent. The identification of a perpetrator in a case like this requires a harsh discipline, separating who a person appears to be from what the evidence says he did. Respectability can delay suspicion because people unconsciously believe that monstrous actions must come from visibly monstrous people. The McDonald case challenged that belief. It suggested that the face of family annihilation could be clean-shaven, professionally trained, emotionally articulate, and socially credible. The courtroom identification would later depend heavily on experts who translated the physical scene into a story of sequence. They were not identifying McDonald by eyewitness memory, but by reconstruction. Reconstruction has a different kind of drama. It asks the audience to imagine not a single decisive moment, but a chain. Colette injured, Kimberly struck, Kristen attacked, McDonald moving, the pajama top shedding fibers. Blood transferred from one space to another, weapons handled, a message written, a call placed. Each link can be challenged. The defense can say the chain is too delicate, too dependent on assumptions, too contaminated by early errors. But the prosecution's power came from accumulation. If one fiber were disputed, there were blood patterns. If one blood pattern were challenged, there was the footprint. If the footprint were questioned, there was the pajama top. If the pajama top were attacked, there were the wounds. If the wounds were explained away, there was the absence of intruder evidence. The identification of McDonald worked like a net rather than a spear. No single strand had to carry the entire case if the strands together held. The prosecution's theory of the night, as it developed, gave the evidence a coherent shape. It suggested that a domestic conflict erupted, perhaps beginning with an argument between Jeffrey and Colette. In that violent eruption, Colette was struck and injured. Kimberly, possibly drawn into the scene by noise or caught in the violence, was injured. The children's rooms became part of the sequence because the violence had to be completed and witnesses eliminated. Colette's blood appearing where it did, the footprint in her blood leaving Kristen's room. The fibers from the pajama top in places inconsistent with McDonald's account, and the distribution of wounds all helped prosecutors argue that McDonald had moved through the house not as a victim searching helplessly after an attack, but as the person controlling the aftermath. After the killings, the theory continued. He staged the scene, writing pig in blood, placing or manipulating the pajama top, discarding weapons outside, creating disorder in the living room, and inflicting or emphasizing his own wounds to support the intruder attack. The chilling part of this reconstruction is its movement from rage to calculation. If the killings began in an uncontrolled explosion, the staging required a different state of mind, a cold turn toward survival. That turn is often what makes staged domestic homicides so disturbing. The violence itself may be impulsive, but the cover-up reveals the offender's priorities after the eruption. The victims are dead or dying, and the perpetrator's attention turns towards self-preservation. In that moment, Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen become not loved ones, but evidence to be managed. The identification of McDonald as perpetrator, therefore, rested not only on the belief that he could kill, but on the belief that he could perform grief afterward. This is where psychological analysis becomes important. Some people imagine performance and emotion as opposites, but they can exist together. A guilty man may feel shock at what he has done and still lie. He may feel fear, grief, panic, anger, and self-pity all at once. He may mourn the loss of the life he destroyed while refusing responsibility for destroying it. Self-pity can be especially powerful in family murderers who see themselves as the true victims of consequences. McDonald's long public posture as an innocent man persecuted by the system fits, for his supporters, the endurance of a wrongfully accused survivor. For his critics, it fits the narcissistic persistence of a man unable to surrender the story that protects him. The identification process had to account for that persistence. A false story told once in panic can collapse under pressure. McDonald's story did not collapse because he kept inhabiting it. He became its central witness, advocate, and symbol. That endurance made him persuasive to some and more suspicious to others. Helena Stokely remained the defense's strongest shadow because she gave the intruder's story a human outline. Yet the prosecution's identification of MacDonald survived her shadow because the case against him did not require proving that every troubled person near Fayetteville was innocent in some absolute metaphysical sense. It required proving beyond a reasonable doubt that MacDonald killed his family. The difference matters. A defense can create doubt by showing that another person may have been involved. But the alternative must do more than echo a defendant's story. It must attach itself to evidence. Stokely's alleged statements were inconsistent, and her courtroom testimony did not deliver the clear confession MacDonald's defense needed. The judge limited some hearsay testimony about her alleged admissions, a decision that would become part of later controversy. But the trial evidence still left jurors with a stark comparison: the unstable, shifting possibility of outsiders against the physical, patterned presence of MacDonald inside the evidence. The jury would eventually choose the house over the ghosts. Before trial, however, the identification of MacDonald had already become a moral act for the people pursuing him. Investigators who believed the evidence had to accept that the first official process had failed. Prosecutors had to accept the burden of trying a famous, difficult, old case. The Kassabs had to accept that their grief would be exposed publicly and tested by defense attack. To identify a perpetrator is not simply to name him. It is to reorganize the entire tragedy around responsibility. If MacDonald was the perpetrator, then the intruder Hunt, the Candle Woman, the hippie Chance, the Manson echoes, all of it became part of the injury done to Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. They had not only been killed. Their deaths had been used to manufacture a false public drama in which the killer asked for sympathy. That is why the identification carried such emotional force. It restored the victims from props in MacDonald's survival story to the center of the crime. It said that the house had not been invaded by strangers from the cultural edge. It had been betrayed from within. The hardest truth in identifying MacDonald was that the answer had been near from the beginning. Lying on the floor, standing in the doorway, speaking on the phone. Investigators often say that in domestic killings, the first circle of suspicion is intimate, but intimacy can blur perception. The husband calling for help seems like the husband needing help. The father injured beside his dead family seems like another victim. The doctor describing the wounds seems like a man trying to understand horror with the tools of his profession. But the house slowly reversed those appearances. The husband became the suspect. The father became the accused. The doctor's knowledge became part of the staging theory. The survivor's story became evidence against him. That reversal is what made the case so enduring and so divisive. It required people to watch a man's public identity turn inside out. By the time MacDonald was formally identified as the perpetrator through indictment and prosecution theory, the case had become a study in how truth can emerge not as revelation but as resistance. The truth, as the government saw it, was what remained after the intruder story failed to make sense of the rooms. It remained in Colette's blood where it should not have been under MacDonald's account. It remained in the pajama top's fibers and punctures. It remained in the absence of convincing traces from 4 supposed attackers. It remained in weapons connected to the home and discarded like scenery. It remained in the cultural convenience of the word pig and the candle-bearing woman. It remained in the grief of a family that began by trusting MacDonald and ended by fighting him. The identification of Jeffrey MacDonald was therefore not the discovery of a stranger. It was the removal of a mask from someone already inside the frame. And when that mask began to come away, what appeared behind it was not the monstrous caricature people expect from true crime, but something more unsettling, a controlled, intelligent man whose story had survived for years because it told America what it was already afraid to believe, while the dead waited for someone to read the quieter story written in their rooms. Part 5, Trial and Verdict, Justice, Reflection, and Conclusion. The trial of Jeffrey MacDonald did not begin as a clean ending to a murder investigation. It began like the reopening of a wound that had never healed properly. By the summer of 1979, more than 9 years had passed since Colette MacDonald, 5-year-old Kimberly, and 2-year-old Kristen had been found dead inside the family quarters at Fort Bragg. And time had changed the case without softening it. The house at 544 Castle Drive was no longer only a physical place, it had become an argument, a memory, a battlefield of experts, lawyers, relatives, journalists, and believers on both sides. Evidence had aged. Witnesses had lived nearly a decade beyond the night they were asked to remember. Jeffrey MacDonald had moved through the world not as a man waiting silently in a cell, but as a physician, a public defender of his own innocence, a surviving husband and father who insisted that the truth had been buried by investigative error. Colette's family had changed too. Their early sympathy had hardened into accusation, especially in Alfred Kassab, whose grief had become a form of pursuit. When the federal trial finally opened in Raleigh, North Carolina, it carried into the courtroom not only the question of what happened on February 17, 1970, but also the weight of every year in which that question had gone unanswered. MacDonald had been indicted in 1975, but legal battles over delay and speedy trial claims slowed the road to trial. And the Supreme Court's later opinions in the case show how deeply the procedural history became entangled with the facts of the murders themselves. Justia Law 1, for the families of the dead, law did not move with the rhythm of grief. It moved in motions, hearings, appeals, reversals, opinions, remands, and calendars. A mother and 2 children had been dead since 1970. But the legal system approached the truth through years of paper. That contrast gave the trial its first emotional tension. The victims had been frozen in a single night, while the accused had been able to live, speak, argue, work, and become a symbol. The prosecution's task was to bring the jury back into the house before MacDonald's long public narrative could carry them away from it. Prosecutors did not present the case as a mystery of strangers. They presented it as a domestic annihilation followed by an elaborate staging. Their case asked jurors to distrust the most emotionally convenient version of events, the version in which a family had been attacked by drug-crazed outsiders and the surviving father had barely escaped. Instead, the government asked them to consider a colder possibility, that the man sitting in court, composed and educated, had killed his pregnant wife and daughters, then shaped the scene around a lie large enough to hide behind. In a courtroom, such a theory requires patience. It cannot depend only on moral outrage. It must teach jurors how to read a room that no longer exists as it did that night. The prosecution, therefore, moved through the evidence piece by piece, turning ordinary household traces into a sequence. They returned to the pajama top, the blood types, the footprint, the fibers, the weapons, the condition of the living room, the absence of persuasive intruder evidence, and the dramatic cultural echoes inside MacDonald's account. They made the house speak slowly. They argued that MacDonald's story was not merely mistaken in places, but structurally false. A traumatized man might confuse details, but the prosecution said MacDonald's version failed at the points where truth should have touched the physical world. If he had fought intruders in the living room while his pajama top was torn, then the living room should have remembered that garment more clearly. If strangers had committed the murders, then the house should have contained stronger traces of strangers. If the weapons belonged to outsiders, then why did evidence suggest they were connected to the home? If MacDonald had been overwhelmed by attackers who slaughtered his family with extreme violence, why were his injuries so different in scale and pattern from theirs? None of these questions alone carried the entire case, but together they formed the prosecution's rhythm, not one impossible fact, but many stubborn inconsistencies. The defense answered by attacking certainty. That was the only possible path in a case with a compromised crime scene and a long delay. McDonald's lawyers did not need to prove every detail of the intruder story beyond doubt. They needed to persuade jurors that the government's reconstruction was too confident, too dependent on flawed evidence, too eager to turn ambiguity into guilt. They pointed toward the early mishandling of the crime scene. They pointed toward the possibility of unknown intruders, especially Helena Stokely, whose unstable presence in the case had kept the alternative theory alive. They argued, directly or indirectly, that the government had locked onto McDonald and then forced the evidence to fit. The defense also benefited from the human fact of McDonald himself. A jury could look at him and see not a monster, but a physician and officer, an articulate man who had been wounded and who had maintained his innocence for years. That surface mattered. Trials are built from evidence, but they are also human theaters in which appearance, tone, and expectation exert pressure. It is easier for many people to imagine violence when the accused looks like violence. McDonald did not. His demeanor forced the prosecution to fight against the oldest disguise in criminal life, respectability. The courtroom, therefore, became a contest between two performances of reality. The defense asked jurors to see a man ruined by tragedy and trapped by investigative failure. The prosecution asked them to see a man whose survival depended on being seen that way. The figure of Helena Stokely entered the trial like a shadow that could not become a body. She was important because she seemed to offer the jury a possible bridge between McDonald's account and the real world. If she had been the woman with the candle, then the intruder story was not fantasy. If she had confessed, hinted, or remembered fragments of involvement, then the government's case might be incomplete. But Stokely's usefulness was weakened by her own instability. She testified, but her memory of the critical period was uncertain. And the court limited some testimony about alleged statements she had made outside court. Later defense arguments would return to this issue repeatedly, claiming that evidence connected to Stokely could have changed the outcome, while prosecutors and courts treated much of it as unreliable, contradictory, or insufficient to overcome the physical case against McDonald. NCDL2, in dramatic terms, Stokely was the perfect, unresolved figure, present enough to haunt, uncertain enough to frustrate, damaged enough to be interpreted in opposite ways. To believers in McDonald's innocence, she was the lost witness whose voice had been muffled. To believers in his guilt, she was the fog into which a guilty man's story tried to vanish. The jury had to decide whether her shadow outweighed the blood and fibers inside the home. The prosecution's strongest advantage was coherence. Their theory made the evidence gather around one person. McDonald was present in the home. His account explained the crime by sending investigators outward, but the physical patterns pulled them back inward. The pajama top was not merely a garment, it was a route. The blood evidence was not merely proof of injury, it was movement. The footprint in Colette's blood leaving Kristen's room was not merely a mark, it was a question with a shape like accusation. The weapons were not merely instruments, they were props in a possible staging. The word written in blood was not merely a word, it was a cultural signal. The prosecution did not have to show jurors a video of the crime. It had to make them feel that McDonald's version required too many impossible silences from the evidence. The defense's strongest advantage was imperfection. The crime scene had not been preserved with modern care. The investigation had been flawed in its early hours. The Article 32 military proceeding had ended with charges dismissed. Years had passed before trial. Alternate suspects had not been fully erased from the imagination. In a criminal trial, doubt does not need to be beautiful, it only needs to be reasonable. McDonald's lawyers tried to make the jury feel that every government conclusion stood on a floor cracked by early mistakes. But the prosecution's argument was that cracks in the floor did not make the entire house disappear. Imperfect evidence could still point in a real direction. A mishandled scene could still contain truths. A defendant could exploit investigative errors without being innocent. That became one of the trial's deeper lessons. justice often has to work through damaged material. The law rarely receives a perfect crime scene, a perfect witness, or a perfect timeline. It receives what remains. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict on August 29, 1979. Jeffrey MacDonald was convicted of second-degree murder in the deaths of Colette and Kimberly and first-degree murder in the death of Kristen. And he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. Wikipedia 3. The verdict landed like a long-delayed answer, but not like peace. Courtroom verdicts can determine legal guilt, but they do not restore the dead, and they do not always quiet the public mind. For the Kassabs, the convictions meant that the legal system had finally named the man they had come to believe was responsible. Yet justice after 9 years carries a bitter taste. Colette had not grown older. Kimberly had not entered adolescence. Kristen had not gone to school. The unborn child had not taken a first breath. The sentence could contain MacDonald, but it could not return time. Justice in cases like this is not a balancing of scales in the sentimental sense. There is no balance. There is only recognition, punishment, and the refusal to let the killer's version become the final word. MacDonald's conviction gave the victims that recognition in law. It said that Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen were not casualties of a nameless invasion. They had been betrayed by the man whose role should have been to protect them. The emotional force of that statement was enormous because it reversed the story MacDonald had told from the beginning. He had placed himself with the victims. The jury placed him with the crime. Still, the verdict did not end the MacDonald case. It opened its next life: appeals, books, public controversy, innocence claims, journalistic battles, DNA arguments, documentaries, and decades of debate over whether the trial had revealed the truth or buried it beneath prosecutorial certainty. MacDonald continued to insist on his innocence. His supporters continued to argue that exculpatory evidence had been ignored or suppressed, that Helena Stokely and other possible intruders had not been properly presented, that the crime scene's flaws undermined the government's reconstruction, and that later DNA testing raised questions. The government and courts repeatedly rejected efforts to overturn the convictions. In 2018, the Fourth Circuit affirmed denial of one of MacDonald's successive post-conviction motions, holding that claims based on alleged prosecutorial misconduct and DNA evidence did not overcome the procedural bar that applied to the case. And in 2021, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of North Carolina announced that MacDonald would remain in prison after another appeal was dismissed at his request with the government's consent. Justia Law. These later legal developments matter because they show how the case refused to become historical dust. MacDonald's convictions survived, but the argument around them remained alive. For some observers, that persistence suggested unresolved injustice. For others, it showed the endurance of a convicted man's refusal to surrender a false identity. The public afterlife of the case became almost as famous as the trial itself because of Joe McGinnis and Fatal Vision. MacDonald had invited McGinnis into his defense world expecting, or at least hoping, that the writer would tell the story of an innocent man. McGinnis attended the trial, gained access to MacDonald and his legal team, and later published a book that portrayed MacDonald as guilty. Fatal Vision, published in 1983, became a major true crime work and helped define public perception of the case. It also led to a bitter dispute between MacDonald and McGinnis over trust, access, and betrayal. Wikipedia 3. Janet Malcolm's later writing on the conflict, especially the journalist and the murderer, turned the MacDonald case into something larger than a murder story. It became a study of the relationship between subject and writer, between confession and observation, between the person who wants his story told and the author who decides what the story means. This literary afterlife is important, but it also creates a danger. The louder the debate about MacDonald, McGinnis, Malcolm, Errol Morris, documentaries, appeals, and legal ethics becomes, the easier it is for Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen to vanish again. The case can become a puzzle about narrative rather than a tragedy about a woman and 2 children. It can become an intellectual argument about uncertainty, and uncertainty can become a kind of elegance. But there was nothing elegant about the crime. There was a pregnant woman who died violently in her own home. There was a 5-year-old child whose life ended before she could understand the adult world around her. There was a 2-year-old child whose room should have contained only the soft disorder of early childhood. The most important ethical task in retelling the MacDonald case is to resist letting the controversy become more vivid than the victims. The consequences of the murders extended far beyond the night and the trial. For Colette's family, the case imposed a second life organized around evidence. Grief became investigative labor. Love became persistence. Alfred Kassab's pursuit of MacDonald required him to live again and again inside the worst details of his family's deaths. That kind of pursuit is often admired from the outside, but admiration can miss the cost. To fight for justice in a case like this means refusing the numbness that might make survival easier. It means reading reports no parent or grandparent should have to read. It means memorizing wounds, blood types, timelines, legal names, procedural rules. It means watching the accused man speak publicly, gather supporters, and insist that he too is a victim. It means accepting that some strangers will doubt you, accuse you of obsession, or treat your family's tragedy as entertainment. The Kassab's role matters because justice did not simply descend from the state. It had to be demanded. Their insistence helped prevent the case from remaining in the shadow of the Army's earlier dismissal. They became, in a painful sense, the voices Colette and the children no longer had. MacDonald's life after conviction also became part of the consequences. From prison and through supporters, he maintained his innocence. This continued denial has different meanings depending on one's view of the case. If he were innocent, the denial would be endurance, the last possession of a man wrongly condemned. If guilty, the denial becomes another form of violence against the dead, a continued refusal to let their story rest in truth. The legal system can imprison a body, but it cannot force confession. It cannot require moral recognition. Many families of victims face this particular cruelty, even after conviction. The offender may keep control of the narrative by denying, appealing, revising, accusing others, and drawing attention back to himself. In the MacDonald case, the very sophistication of the public debate gave that denial unusual power. Every new book or documentary reopened the question for audiences who had not lived through the original trial. Every claim of new evidence seemed to promise revelation. Every critique of the prosecution revived the possibility that the wrong story had won. Yet courts continued to uphold the convictions, and MacDonald remained imprisoned under consecutive life sentences. The law, whatever doubts persisted in public discussion, kept its answer. The moral reflection at the end of the case begins with the nature of the lie alleged by the prosecution. If MacDonald killed his family and staged the scene, then the lie was not merely a defensive statement made under panic. It was a world built over the dead. It required turning Colette's blood into a message, the children's deaths into supporting scenery, public fear into a shield, and his own wounds into credentials. It required asking investigators, relatives, journalists, and eventually the public to see him as the center of the tragedy. That is a particular form of narcissistic violence, not only destroying lives, but reorganizing the meaning of their deaths around the perpetrator's need to survive socially and psychologically. In such a crime, the staging is not separate from the murder. It continues the act. The victims are denied not only breath, but truth. Their home is made to lie about them. Their final moments are rewritten by the person who benefits most from the rewriting. That is why the prosecution's victory mattered even beyond punishment. It stripped legal authority from MacDonald's version and returned it, however imperfectly, to the evidence. Yet a responsible conclusion must also acknowledge why the case remains controversial. The investigation had flaws. The early scene handling left openings. Stokely's presence and statements continue to trouble some observers. Later DNA arguments and claims of suppressed evidence have kept debate alive. Serious writers and filmmakers have challenged parts of the government narrative, including Errol Morris, whose work questioned whether the case against MacDonald had been shaped too heavily by accepted storytelling and flawed certainty. The New Yorker 5, but controversy is not the same as innocence. A case can contain errors and still reach the right verdict. A defendant can point to investigative imperfections without explaining the stronger evidence against him. A shadow outside the house does not automatically erase the footprints inside it. The danger, especially for audiences drawn to complex true crime, is mistaking complication for exoneration. The MacDonald case is complicated. It is also, in the eyes of the courts that upheld the convictions, resolved in law. The distinction matters. Doubt can be intellectually stimulating, but for victims' families, it can become a room they are forced to re-enter forever. Each revival of the case asks them, again, to watch the dead be questioned. The deeper lesson of the MacDonald murders is not only about forensic evidence or courtroom strategy. It is about the stories people are willing to believe when those stories protect them from more intimate fears. The intruder narrative was powerful because it preserved a boundary. Evil came from outside. It had long hair, a candle, drug language, and weapons. It belonged to cultural chaos, not to the family portrait. That version allowed the public to keep faith with appearances. The doctor was a doctor. The father was a father. The home was safe until strangers broke it. The prosecution's version destroyed that comfort. It said the danger was already inside, not as a monster in obvious disguise, but as a man whose social identity made him difficult to suspect. This is why the case still unsettles. It touches a fear more personal than strangers in the dark. It asks whether the person standing closest to the victims, the person with the greatest duty of care, can also be the person most invested in controlling how their deaths are understood. The consequences of that fear extend beyond one family. They challenge how society reads violence behind respectable doors. Domestic violence, family annihilation, and intimate homicide often hide beneath ordinary surfaces until the final act exposes what outsiders failed to see. The MacDonald case became famous partly because of its unusual facts, but also because it revealed a common blindness. People often trust status more than evidence at first. A physician's calm voice can seem more real than a bloodstain. A military title can seem more persuasive than a pattern of fibers. A surviving husband's grief can seem more human than a dead wife's silent testimony. Justice required reversing that hierarchy. It required allowing the quiet, material truth of the house to outweigh the living man's controlled performance. In the end, the verdict did not make the case simple. It made responsibility official. Jeffrey MacDonald was convicted and sentenced, and despite decades of litigation, he remained the legally identified killer of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. But the ending remains profound rather than triumphant, because no sentence can undo the central theft. Colette never lived to give birth. Kimberly never grew beyond 5. Kristen never grew beyond 2. The unborn child exists in the story as a future erased before it could become a name. Castle Drive became an address that people remember for horror, though for the children it had once been only home. That is the final cruelty of murder. It colonizes memory. A bedroom becomes evidence. A pajama top becomes a courtroom object. A family photograph becomes a public document. A woman's marriage becomes a motive theory. A child's bed becomes part of a reconstruction. True crime must be careful with that transformation. To tell the story well is not to polish the horror, but to keep returning the human beings to the center of it. Colette MacDonald should be remembered not only as a victim in a famous case, but as a young pregnant mother whose future was taken inside a place where she should have been safe. Kimberly should be remembered not as a blood type in a forensic map, but as a 5-year-old girl whose world was still small enough to be bounded by family rooms and bedtime. Kristen should be remembered not as the youngest count in an indictment, but as a toddler whose dependence made the betrayal almost impossible to contemplate. Justice, in this case, arrived through verdicts, sentences, and appellate endurance. But moral justice depends on refusing to let the killer's narrative eclipse the lives he was convicted of ending. The McDonald case began in darkness, with a phone call and a story about intruders. It ended in law with convictions and life sentences. But its deepest meaning lies in the struggle between a voice and a house, the living man speaking, the dead answering through what remained. For years, the voice was loud, dramatic, wounded, and insistent. The house was quiet. It held its evidence without emotion. It did not argue. It waited for investigators, prosecutors, jurors, judges, relatives, writers, and the public to decide whether they would believe the performance or the pattern. The jury in 1979 chose the pattern. The courts, through decades of challenges, allowed that choice to stand. And behind all the legal language, behind every appeal and book and documentary, the same truth remains at the center. A mother and 2 children were killed before dawn in a military home, and the man who claimed to have survived their killers was ultimately judged to have been the person from whom they needed protection most. Part 6, Extended Aftermath, Public Memory, and Final Reflection. The story of the Jeffrey McDonald family murders did not end when the jury returned its verdict in 1979. Because some cases do not close in the public mind even after the law has spoken. They continue in appeals, in prison interviews, in books with competing moral centers, in documentaries that rearrange old evidence under new lighting, in families who grow older around an absence, and in audiences who keep returning to the same question because the answer, though legally settled, feels emotionally difficult to hold. After McDonald was convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, the case moved into a second existence. One less focused on the physical rooms of 544 Castle Drive and more focused on the struggle over interpretation. The house was gone from daily life, but its evidence survived in transcripts, exhibits, photographs, laboratory notes, appellate briefs, and the memories of those who had entered it. The victims remained forever young in the public record, Colette as the pregnant mother, Kimberly as the 5-year-old daughter, Kristen as the 2-year-old child, the unborn baby as a life that never reached the world. McDonald, by contrast, continued aging. That contrast became one of the case's quiet cruelties. The dead stayed fixed in February 1970. While the man convicted of killing them kept producing new chapters, new motions, new lawyers, new claims, new media attention, new attempts to reopen the moral verdict already reached in court. His challenges continued for decades, and federal authorities later noted that his convictions had been repeatedly rejected in challenges at multiple levels of the federal courts. In 2021, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of North Carolina announced that his appeal from the denial of compassionate release had been dismissed and that his consecutive life sentences remained in place. Department of Justice 1. This long legal afterlife matters because it reveals something about the nature of denial, doubt, and public fascination. For McDonald supporters, every new petition appeared as another attempt to correct a miscarriage of justice. For the families of the victims and those convinced by the prosecution's case, every new petition appeared as another refusal to let Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen rest beneath the truth established at trial. That is the painful duality of post-conviction litigation in famous cases. The legal process exists because wrongful convictions do happen, because evidence can be mishandled, because prosecutors can fail, because witnesses can lie, because science changes, because justice must remain open to correction. But the same process can also become a stage on which a guilty person continues performing innocence, drawing energy and attention back to himself while the victims' names are spoken only as the reason he is confined. The McDonald case sits inside that tension. It is not wrong for a legal system to examine claims carefully, especially in a case with documented early investigative problems. But it is also necessary to recognize that repeated litigation can become part of the narrative struggle. The convicted person keeps saying, "Look again." The evidence keeps saying, "We already looked." The family keeps saying, "How many times must the dead be cross-examined?" The public keeps listening because unresolved stories feel alive. And alive stories are easier to consume than settled grief. MacDonald's continued insistence on innocence gave the case a kind of engine. Had he confessed after conviction, the public mythology might have narrowed. The focus might have shifted more permanently toward Colette and the children, toward the psychology of family annihilation, toward the failures and eventual persistence of the justice system. But denial kept the story open. Denial created a marketplace of alternative interpretations. Denial gave authors, filmmakers, lawyers, and viewers a reason to return. In that sense, MacDonald's voice never stopped competing with the House. The trial had legally chosen the house, the fibers, the blood, the footprint, the wound patterns, the stage-looking intruder narrative. But public culture is not bound by verdict in the same way a prison system is. Public culture loves doubt, especially when doubt can be made cinematic. A man in prison saying he is innocent offers drama. A dead woman and 2 dead children offer tragedy. Drama travels more easily than tragedy because drama promises movement, reversal, revelation. Tragedy asks only that we sit with loss. The MacDonald case became one of the most written about and argued over murder cases in American criminal history because it offered both a legally resolved tragedy and a never-ending drama of claimed innocence. The media afterlife began most powerfully with Joe McGinnis's Fatal Vision, a book that did more than describe the trial. It shaped the emotional architecture through which millions encountered the case. MacDonald had cooperated with McGinnis expecting, or at least hoping, that the writer would produce a sympathetic portrait. Instead, the book presented him as guilty, and that betrayal, whether seen as journalistic honesty or moral deception, became almost a case within the case. The relationship between subject and writer grew so infamous that Janet Malcolm later used it as the foundation for a broader examination of journalism itself, asking what happens when a writer gains access through trust but ultimately produces a portrait the subject experiences as treachery. In this second public drama, MacDonald again occupied the center, not only as convicted murderer or claimed innocent man, but as a subject who believed his story had been taken from him. That literary controversy made the case intellectually fashionable in a way that was both illuminating and dangerous. It illuminated the ethics of storytelling, the tension between access and truth, the manipulations that can occur on both sides of a writer-subject relationship. But it also threatened, once again, to move Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen to the margins. The argument became MacDonald versus McGinnis, then MacDonald versus the government, MacDonald versus the press, MacDonald versus the legal system. The victims risked becoming the ground on which other men fought about truth. That is a pattern true crime storytelling must resist with deliberate care. A murder case can become famous for its controversy, but the moral center must remain with the people whose lives were taken. Colette was not a symbol in a debate about journalism. Kimberly was not a forensic puzzle piece placed there to test a theory of narrative reliability. Kristen was not a detail in a lawyer's strategy. Their deaths created the case. Their lives should anchor its meaning. The legal consequences after conviction were extensive and technical, involving appeals, habeas petitions, claims about withheld evidence, DNA testing, and arguments concerning alternative suspects. In 2018, the Fourth Circuit rejected one major successive post-conviction effort, holding that MacDonald had not satisfied the demanding requirements needed to overcome procedural barriers based on claims involving alleged DNA evidence and alleged prosecutorial misconduct. Case Law 2. Later, during the COVID-19 era, MacDonald sought compassionate release, citing age. health, and time served, but the district court denied relief. And the government announced in September 2021 that the appeal from that denial had been dismissed, leaving his life sentences intact. Department of Justice 1. These later rulings did not satisfy everyone. Because legal finality rarely satisfies those who believe the system was wrong at the start. But they're essential to the final record. The convictions did not simply survive because people forgot to challenge them. They survived repeated challenges. That endurance does not mean every question about the investigation disappears. But it does mean that the law continued to find the case against McDonald strong enough to stand. One of the most revealing aspects of the aftermath is how different audiences respond to imperfection. The McDonald investigation had real problems, particularly in the early handling of the crime scene. Those flaws gave the defense and later supporters material to work with. They allowed the argument that the government's certainty should be distrusted. Yet imperfection does not automatically equal innocence. This is one of the hardest lessons in criminal justice and true crime interpretation. A flawed investigation can convict the right person. A clean investigation can convict the wrong person. A suspicious alternative witness can be both genuinely troubling and ultimately insufficient. A defendant can be mistreated in some procedural sense and still be guilty of the crime. Audiences often want moral neatness. Either the investigation was perfect and the conviction was pure, or the investigation was flawed and the conviction must be false. Real cases are rarely so clean. The McDonald case forces a more disciplined reading. The early scene was imperfect, but the prosecution argued that the central evidence survived those imperfections. The defense raised alternative possibilities, but those possibilities repeatedly failed to displace the evidence that placed the pattern of the crime around McDonald. The danger for viewers is to confuse the existence of doubt with the legal meaning of reasonable doubt. A famous case can always generate questions if examined long enough. The question is not whether questions can be asked. The question is whether those questions create a credible alternative explanation stronger than the one accepted by the jury and sustained by the courts. The figure of Helena Stokely continued to haunt the aftermath because she embodied that difference between question and answer. She was unstable, contradictory, and linked in public imagination to McDonald's description of a woman intruder. For supporters of McDonald, she remained the door through which the intruder story might still enter. For skeptics, she remained evidence of how a famous case can attract damaged witnesses, half-confessions, and unreliable memories that feel meaningful because people want them to be meaningful. Her shadow shows how alternative suspects function in public narratives. They do not always need to be proven to remain useful. They only need to keep the official story from feeling complete. In court, however, shadows must become evidence. The law cannot convict a shadow, and it cannot free a convicted person merely because a shadow exists. That distinction may feel cold, but it protects both defendants and victims. Without it, any famous case could be permanently destabilized by rumor. Yet the emotional appeal of Stokely's role is understandable. The intruder story is easier to bear. It locates evil outside the family. It turns the murder of children into the act of strangers, which is horrible but less psychologically intimate than the act of a father. The human mind often prefers the horror that preserves structure. A stranger's violence says the world is dangerous. A parent's violence says safety itself can be an illusion. The McDonald case endures because the legally accepted truth is the harder horror. Another consequence lies in how the case changed public understanding of staged crime scenes and family annihilation. When the murders first happened, the cultural imagination was ready for McDonald's intruders. The Manson crimes had made the figure of the drug-crazed outsider a national nightmare. McDonald's account borrowed, whether truthfully or falsely, from that fear. In the decades since, investigators, journalists, and audiences have become more aware that offenders sometimes stage scenes by exploiting public assumptions. A burglar is invented because burglary is familiar. A suicide is arranged because suicide can hide domestic murder. A stranger attack is described because strangers feel plausible in a violent society. A hate message or symbolic word can be written not to express motive, but to create one. The MacDonald case became a lesson in looking beyond theatrical surfaces. The word written in blood was shocking, but shock is not the same as truth. The woman with the candle was memorable, but memorability is not corroboration. The overturned objects in the living room suggested disorder, but disorder must match the mechanics of a fight. The surviving man's wounds seem to prove victimhood, but wounds must be compared with the whole scene. In this way, the case contributed to a broader forensic and psychological awareness. Staging is not only about objects, it is about directing attention. The alleged staging in the MacDonald case directed attention toward America's fear of outsiders and away from the intimate space where the evidence gathered. The aftermath also exposes the burden placed on victims' relatives in long-contested cases. Alfred and Mildred Kassab did not merely mourn, they fought a narrative. That fight required them to become public figures in a tragedy they did not choose. Alfred Kassab's transformation from supporter to accuser remains one of the most emotionally powerful arcs in the case because it shows how love can become investigative endurance. He had once accepted MacDonald into the family. He had once had reason to see him as another victim. To reverse that view required a devastating moral reorientation. It meant accepting that the person who claimed to mourn Colette and the children may have been the person who destroyed them. For a family, that realization is almost a second crime. It rewrites memories. It turns past kindness into possible manipulation. It makes every earlier conversation feel contaminated. The Kassabs' pursuit of justice demanded that they keep confronting this reality. They had to fight not only legal delay but also MacDonald's image, his supporters, and the public's appetite for an alternative story. Their persistence helped bring the case to trial, but persistence is not the same as healing. A verdict can validate a family's belief, but it cannot restore the emotional years consumed by the fight. It cannot give them back private grief, the kind that might have belonged only to family rather than to courts and cameras. It cannot undo the fact that Colette and the girls became public property in the imagination of strangers. That is another consequence true crime must acknowledge when a case becomes famous. The victims' loved ones lose control over how grief is handled. Their worst day becomes content. Their family photographs become evidence, illustration, marketing, argument. Every retelling should carry that discomfort. MacDonald's long imprisonment created its own strange public rhythm. As he aged, some articles and advocates emphasized his health, his decades behind bars, and the possibility of release. In 2006, reporting noted that he had become eligible to seek parole years earlier, but had long resisted doing so because applying could be perceived as an admission of guilt. Later, he did pursue release-related options, including parole and compassionate release efforts. WRAL News 3. These efforts raise difficult questions about punishment and memory. When a convicted killer grows old, the body can seem less threatening. Age softens the visual image. The gray-haired prisoner no longer resembles the young man accused of moving through a blood-stained house. But punishment for murder is not based only on future dangerousness. It is also based on accountability for lives taken. Colette did not get to grow old. Kimberly and Kristen did not get to become teenagers, adults, mothers, professionals, friends, anything at all beyond the ages at which they were killed. The unborn child never entered time. When people ask whether an aging prisoner has served enough, they must also ask what measure could possibly be enough for the erasure of an entire family. That does not mean societies should abandon compassion or refuse to consider age and illness in every case. It means compassion must not become amnesia. In the MacDonald case, the courts and government kept the life sentences in place, and the continued confinement became part of the final legal answer. Yet public attention often returns to MacDonald's experience of punishment more readily than to the victim's experience of lost time. That imbalance is another reason the final reflection must name the victims repeatedly and specifically. Colette, Kimberly, Kristen, the unborn child. The cultural legacy of the case also shows how true crime can become a mirror for each generation's anxieties. In 1970, the fear was hippies, drugs, cult violence. The collapse of domestic safety under the pressure of social upheaval. In the 1980s, the case became a story of courtroom drama, best-selling narrative nonfiction, and the authority of the true crime writer. In the 1990s and 2000s, it became part of the growing public fascination with wrongful convictions, forensic reanalysis, and DNA. In the streaming era, it became material for documentaries that invite viewers to reweigh evidence from their couches, pausing over photographs and testimony as if moral certainty can be reached through binge-watching. Each era sees a different MacDonald case because each era brings different fears. But the facts at the center do not change their moral gravity. A pregnant woman and 2 children were killed in their home. The husband and father survived. He claimed intruders. Investigators concluded he staged the scene. A jury convicted him. The convictions endured. Around those facts, culture has built layer after layer of interpretation. Some layers illuminate, some obscure. The storyteller's job is to separate the two as carefully as possible. A respectful true crime ending should not pretend that the case is simple merely because a verdict exists. But it should also not pretend that endless controversy is automatically profundity. Sometimes controversy survives because the convicted person has successfully kept himself at the center. Sometimes doubt survives because audiences prefer mystery to mourning. Mystery gives the viewer something to solve. Mourning gives the viewer someone to remember. The MacDonald case demands both discipline and humility. Discipline means acknowledging the legal outcome, the weight of the forensic case, and the repeated failure of post-conviction efforts to overturn the convictions. Humility means recognizing the flaws, the contested evidence, and the fact that no reconstruction can give Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen their voices back. But humility should not become paralysis. The law reached an answer, and the answer was that Jeffrey MacDonald murdered his family. The final moral question is not only whether we believe that answer, but what we do with it. If we accept that he staged the scene, then we must understand the staging as an extension of violence. It was not merely a lie told to police. It was a theft of meaning. Colette's final moments were transformed into a story about strangers. Kimberly and Kristen's deaths were folded into a narrative designed to save the man convicted of killing them. The bloody message became a cultural signal, the candle woman became a mythic distraction, the intruder's story became a shelter. The killer, in the prosecution's version accepted by the jury, did not only ask to escape punishment. He asked to be mourned as a victim beside the people he destroyed. That is one of the most disturbing psychological elements of the case. It suggests a self so dominant that even the deaths of a wife and children could be reorganized around its survival. In that light, the long denial becomes not simply legal strategy, but identity preservation. To confess would not only mean admitting the murders. It would mean surrendering the constructed self, the innocent doctor, the persecuted survivor, the man betrayed by government and writer and court. For some offenders, the lie becomes the last home they live in. They furnish it with grievances. They defend it with appeals. They invite supporters inside. They grow old there. The MacDonald case may be understood, in part, as the story of a man who built such a home over the ruins of his real one. The victim's true home was different. It was not the courtroom, not the best-selling book, not the appellate record. It was the ordinary house before the crime, the rooms where Kimberly and Kristen slept, the routines Colette carried, the pregnancy moving quietly toward birth, the small domestic disorder of a young family on a military base. That is the home that deserves the final image. Not the stage disorder after violence, but the life before it. Colette as more than a body in a master bedroom. Kimberly as more than a child in a forensic chart. Kristen as more than the count that made one conviction first-degree murder. The unborn baby as more than a silent addition to the tragedy. To restore them in memory, even briefly, is to resist the killer's narrative gravity. It is to say that the point of the story is not whether Jeffrey MacDonald can still provoke debate, but that 4 futures ended and the world rearranged itself around the question of why. In the end, the MacDonald case stands as a warning about appearances, about narrative power, and about the patience of evidence. It warns that the most dangerous person in a room is not always the one who looks dangerous. It warns that a polished voice can turn fear into cover. It warns that public panic can be used as a tool by someone who understands what society is ready to believe. It warns that investigative mistakes can wound a case for decades, even when the central truth remains strong. It warns that media can both expose and exploit. It warns that justice, even when achieved, may arrive late and incomplete. Most of all, it warns that the dead depend on the living to read carefully. Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen could not testify in the ordinary way. Their testimony existed in the house, in blood, fabric, injury, absence, contradiction. The jury heard that testimony through experts and lawyers, imperfectly translated into human language. The courts reviewed it through procedure. Writers argued over it. Viewers still returned to it. But beneath every argument lies the same cold morning at Fort Bragg, the same silence after the sirens, the same family gone from the rooms where they should have awakened. The final reflection should not belong to the man who survived to explain. It should belong to those who did not survive to answer. Justice named Jeffrey MacDonald as the killer, but remembrance must name Colette, Kimberly, Kristen, and the child who never had a chance to be named in life. Their absence is the deepest evidence, the one no appeal can erase.